Coming up, back in the summer of 2016, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and the former Labour MP Gisela Stuart contributed to an article in the Sun newspaper which claimed that Brexit would mean that the NHS will be stronger, class sizes smaller and taxes lower. We'll have more money to spend on our priorities, wages will be higher and fuel bills will be lower. The following year, Rees-Mogg added to that list by claiming that leaving the EU would mean much cheaper food and an increase in people's disposable income. It's quite clear now, in 2022, that those claims were all either downright lies or, alternatively, incredibly stupid and ignorant. In this video, I'll be looking at the latest consequences of the failed Brexit experiment, including the rhetoric surrounding immigration and how the broken promises and wild claims from Brexitist politicians have caused the general toxicity of this government. Stay tuned. If you enjoy watching the Truth to Power channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me out by hitting the like button and especially by sharing a link to this video on your social media platforms. For Rishi Sunak and the current hard-right government, life after the EU means public spending cuts, higher taxes for working people, the removal of environmental protections and the dilution of our individual and collective rights. This is not what millions of Leave supporters thought they were voting for in the 2016 referendum, nor what the Tory manifesto set out in the last two elections. The toxic Sue Ellen Braverman says she wants to slash immigration. But others in the cabinet and their Tufton Street masters are looking at the 130,000 Brits emigrating from the UK every year and realising that along with falling birth rates, the population size will shrink significantly over the coming decades unless we liberalise the UK's immigration systems. And a shrinking population means there's no chance of growing the economy. And Tories being Tories, money trumps everything. So, the economy trumps all, as we've seen with the Indian trade deal, allowing thousands of Indian citizens to come and live and work in the UK in a move that will send a certain kind of Brexitist into a racist temper tantrum. But the Tory government has a dilemma. The dog whistle politics and the weaponisation of the immigration issue is now their biggest barrier to growing the economy, apart from the failed Brexit experiment itself, of course. Boris Johnson purged the Conservative Party of its One Nation pro-European wing, insisting that all MPs standing in the 2019 election swore allegiance to the Brexit experiment. That Brexit filter upturned Conservative politics and brought the resulting hard right-wing, intellectually diminished Tory party to power on the back of that trite three-word slogan, "Get Brexit Done." And as the Brexit experiment unravels, the reason for their success is also a guarantee of their failure. Michael Gove claims that Brexit has been a significant success, offering as the only justification for this the lie that Britain's superfast vaccine rollout was because the country was free of EU constraints. The truth is, we were at that time still a member of the EU's European Medicines Agency, and in any case, there were never any EU constraints on emergency vaccine rollouts by member states at any time. Other Brexitists like Rees-Mogg and senior economist Andrew Lillico claim that we'll need 40 or even 50 years before we can really tell if the Brexit experiment has been a success. Don't know about you, I don't remember reading that on the side of that bus. But just about every other economist would dispute even that futuristic prediction. Economists overwhelmingly thought, and still do think, that Brexit, rather than causing a blowout for the UK economy, would be more like a slow puncture, undermining UK competitiveness and getting worse over time. The slow puncture at this stage now has an audible hiss, with powerful viral videos from the Financial Times and Ros Atkins from the BBC circulating over the past week or two, setting out the detailed and indisputable economic case that the Brexit experiment has failed. And it's not just about economic statistics. There's been a fundamental impact on our society as a whole, with those 130,000 British citizens emigrating annually, together with up to 2 million EU workers who've returned home after the advisory referendum. The resulting labour shortages in hospitality, healthcare, the building trades, dentistry, social care, the court system, retail and elsewhere makes Britain in 2022 feel like a country that's falling apart at the seams. It's a country of long waits, privatised inadequate public transport, shitty coastal waters, lengthening queues, and an uneasy feeling that not nearly enough people are being employed to keep everything running smoothly. The empty shelves in the shops are getting worse too, with less variety of fresh produce and all seeming less fresh than it used to as well. Less food is being imported due to Brexit red tape, and 25% of homegrown crops are being left to rot in the fields due to a lack of agricultural workers. The queues at Dover are now routine for lorry drivers and will now be a regular feature of British summers for holidaymakers. And this dismal feeling of shortages, waits and things falling apart at the seams is reflected in official figures. The EU's gross domestic product, for example, has grown by 8.5% since Brexit, while the UK's figure is less than half of that, just 3.8%. And the UK is behind all the other G7 nations in its recovery from the pandemic. If a country imposes economic sanctions on itself, then of course this is what happens, and it's gonna get worse. Remember, as 2022 draws to a close, the government's own Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, is still sticking with what it projected in March 2020, that the failed Brexit experiment is and will be responsible for reducing UK productivity and GDP by 4% year on year for the next 15 years. The latest polls show that all these factors are contributing to an increasing awareness amongst the population that the Brexit experiment has indeed been a failure. Taking out don't knows, non-partisan poll trackers now show a massive 61% saying Britain was wrong to vote to leave the EU, and only 39% saying it was the right decision. And that gap is trending ever larger, as you can clearly see in this chart. A huge proportion of the population feels incredibly let down by the false Brexitist promises of higher wages, prosperity and a better funded NHS, none of which have actually materialised. But significantly, and this is really the most important point, Brexit made it okay for politicians to do things to the country that even their own experts told them would devastate the lives of millions. So, as the 2016 Brexit deceits become ever more obvious, the very fact that those lying Brexitist politicians won power and have retained it ever since has kind of normalised this new type of dishonest, tabloid, populist British politics that, like fascism, relies on identifying hate figures and enemies in order to fire up its supporters. Enemies that the current government have vocally identified include immigrants, lefty lawyers, the BBC, the Guardian reading tofu eating wokerati, designers of traffic calming schemes, farmers who want solar panels in their fields, woke policemen, militant trade unions, lazy GPs, nurses that expect to be paid for what is after all a vocation, High Court judges, the EU still, and the French in particular, though the jury's out according to Truss. Then there's the undefined anti-growth coalition, the RNLI, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Bank of England, Prince Charles wanting to go to COP27, the European Court of Human Rights, Jack Monroe, Channel 4, our Remainer universities, Tory majority select committees, including the one looking into Johnson misleading Parliament, environmental activists and protesters, ex-footballers who take an interest in politics, the Scottish and Welsh devolved governments, money-saving expert Martin Lewis, and the list just keeps on growing ever longer. On top of all this, we now have an inflammatory Home Secretary using language borrowed from the racist National Front back in the 1970s, falsely referring to invasions of illegal immigrants when invasion implies they're intended to cause harm and illegal is just a plain lie. The 1951 UN Convention on Refugees states that it's a fundamental human right to be able to claim asylum. Besides, this government closed down all the conventional routes for asylum seekers to reach Britain and have spurned offers by the French to establish British refugee processing centres on French soil, which would solve the boats in the Channel crisis overnight. But it suits the government to use the immigration situation to fire up their base, as it distracts from the economic nightmare of this government's own making. The whole toxic debate over immigration is a materialisation of the ultimate Brexit paradox, by which I mean this. Brexit made it okay for politicians to lie and misinform the population. It made it acceptable to do things that would harm the country and heighten division. Those in government find it necessary to manufacture and inflame hatred towards immigrants and all those other enemies I listed as a distraction from the damage they themselves have inflicted on swathes of the electorate since the beginning of austerity in 2010, and which the failed Brexit experiment has just intensified. And this political turn to the dark side has given a frightening boost to exactly the kind of polarised politics that Brexit's failure ought to have consigned to the dustbin of history. And this is one of the subjects I'll be discussing with Michael Lambert in a bonus video on Wednesday this coming week. If you have any questions you'd like to ask us, just pop them in the comments below over the weekend and we'll answer as many of them as we can. Until then, thanks for watching.